Well, thank you very much, and it's a real delight to be here. And I'd like to begin by particularly thanking Naki for the privilege of being a convening lead author for this global energy assessment, having spent, it's sort of a very good conclusion, if you will, or close to it, to my 50-year, half-century energy career, but one which has seen a lot of frustration because having been involved in the technology for most of that career and seeing so little application of it within the constraints of policies and otherwise, it is very important because while it hasn't been a big impact to people of my age, as I think about my grandchildren and the world going forward in the 21st century, the transformation of every dimension of energy is going to be critical to truly a sustainable 21st century economy and quality of life. The lead authors here for this have been very great. They've done most of the hard work. And Felix and Asmaran from here in the United States with the EEE systems, Brian Fisher, who was with from Australia with BA Economics, Roger Fouquet from Spain with the Basque Climate Change Center, and Hans-Holger Wagner from Austria, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And contributing authors, Mariana Haag from Germany with the University of Hohenheim, and then Richard Hosier and Alan Miller from here in the United States with the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation, and finally then Sabine Schnittiger from Australia with BE Economics. So they all did the heavy lifting and putting this together as an excellent chapter for the effort. Well, we're going to go back here. Before I go into that chapter just a minute, I want to touch something else here. The primary role of this chapter is to define the nature and magnitude of the demands on local and global energy systems resulting from worldwide economic activities, both positive and negative. Energy fuels the economy everywhere in the world, and access to secure, clean, affordable energy carriers fundamentally defines the modern economy. Unfortunately, the public and private funding for the energy-related R&D and deployment remains much less than the amount needed to achieve a truly sustainable future. There are still more than 1.5 billion people in the world who do not have access to energy as we know of energy in any form. They're still living in the Middle Ages, literally. And that is a huge number, totally inconsistent with a sustainable future. And from my experience, and having been in many of these areas, women fill the energy gap. They are the energy providers, doing the work without any support from energy as we would know it. And that really holds women in those parts of the world, to a large extent, prisoners, rather than people who can really enjoy the world that they're living in. And this comparative energy intensity slide, I think, is rather interesting, of various global regions. Global demographics here, the developing nations shifting from agriculture as their basic economy to more energy intensive and more productive commercial enterprises. And for the first time, the world's population is urbanized. The majority is urbanized. And that is a tremendous change. the largest urban areas are emerging in developing regions, as we heard, the gentleman from India. These are the areas where the huge new urban centers are being developed, and yet they have no local energy available to be able to fill those needs. And energy access is a very secure or severe constraint. Now, I won't spend a lot of time I spent my career in electricity, but I'm not here to sell electricity, but it is important to recognize that electricity access is the key 21st century energy provider. We really need to emphasize that, because the use of renewable energies, the movement to non-oil transportation, every dimension of things today we think of with energy really are moving and need to move to be sustainable to the truly electrical foundation. That's going to be very important. And this little slide here, Energy and Economy, kind of points out the little bit of the corollaries there on it, and you can see that energy is the cumulative GDP across the bottom, and then the energy intensity per GDP is vertical. And so you can see the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union are the least energy efficient, if you will, in the world as overall. And you go across, and even here in North America, we're right at the global average, but Western Europe is considerably ahead of us, as are some of these other areas that are really moving more aggressively in terms of streamlining and making efficient energy. This country has a long ways to go in that regard, and we are not the world leader. And this talks a little bit about the energy and economy, the average external costs. This focuses on the European Union, but it is typical for the world. And these slides show the relationship and the various costs: climate change, human health, crops, loss of biodiversity. All of these factors, major cost implications of all of these energy technologies and energy sources across the world. Now, I would like to underscore something. While we are moving and encouraging the maximum use of renewable energy, clean renewable energy, which is at the lowest levels here, it is unrealistic to think that we will have, on a global basis, in the 21st century, a truly, purely, solely renewable energy economy. It may happen, it could, I guess, at the outside edge, but for realistic planning purposes, we need to recognize that coal, nuclear power, natural gas are going to all be very important energy resources in many parts of the world. They're not here in California, perhaps, but in many parts of the world, because those are the energy sources. So when I tell people, don't dam the energy source, dam the obsolete technology that we have. Because all of those energy sources, we have far more efficient, secure, reliable, and safe technologies that can be applied to maintain those energy sources as we move forward in this century. So I would just say, on a global basis, don't throw out the traditional energy sources that will remain very important. Focus here on one slide. This is the United States, but as having been kind of a global leader in this whole transformation, although we haven't necessarily done the most of it, I think this is a very interesting slide. This just shows in electricity here the relative investments here: distribution, transmission, and generation. And the pattern here is important, and I would just underscore this, because while it's focused on the United States, it's been the model for much of the world. Back in the mid-1930s, in the middle of the Depression, the federal government said, look, we will never get out of this depression until we electrify this country. So the whole focus there was on getting electricity throughout the country. So that's why we created the monopoly utilities, because we couldn't have that, just everybody just sticking wires around. We needed to have a very organized, focused system to put in the transmission and distribution system that would take the power to all of the sources, to all of the users. So that was the right thing to do back then, but we are still, by and large, operating under those same rules. And you can see that that worked well, but by the mid-1970s, we basically filled the gaps, and it's all been falling down since then, and we've not been replacing. We need to reinvent electricity today. We should have done it, I would say, at least 20 years ago. But anyway, really reinventing it for the 21st century, because this is still, electricity almost everywhere in the world is still an analog electromechanical system. And it is totally out of connection with the digital economy that we have today. And I tell people who are not around in energy or electricity, I say, if you had a railroad and it took you 10 days to open or close a switch, I think you'd call that a pretty dumb railroad, and you wouldn't move many trains. Well, relative to the speed of light of electricity, even though you think a switch opens and closes like that, relative to the speed of light, it's equivalent to a 10-day delay. That's why we are limited today in how much renewable energy we can reliably put into the power system. Because renewable energy, solar, wind, is operating at the speed of light. And the system has to be able to absorb that and take it on. And that's why there's a lot of local activities all over the world now looking at modernizing the distribution system, incorporating renewable energy into the communities, and using that as a major energy source. So that is a very important step forward here that we need to do here. It's interesting to note that the leadership of both political parties in this country, including President Obama, are on written record as saying that this country will never have a 21st century stable, high-level economy with a 20th century electricity system. So basically the same thing that was said back in the mid-1930s, and it's just as realistic. But the federal government today really defers to the states for this, and the states are not moving, with a few exceptions, very fast. Hurricane Sandy this year has been a step that has opened the door in a number of parts of the country in this regard. But we really can reinvent Thomas Edison. That's what electricity is going for. Thomas Edison, when he created electricity, it was all distributed energy and communities. And then, of course, we didn't have the technology to support him, so we went to alternating current and big central station power plants and long lines all over the place. And that was necessary then, but we have the technology today to literally reinvent Thomas Edison. And we need to end what I would call iron curtain meters around the world. Citizens, whether it's a smart or a dumb meter today, are by and large trapped behind an iron curtain meter. You do not get the information and the control of your energy at the space and time you need. And like my grandchildren tell me, Grandpa, you talk a good digital line, but you're about as analog as anyone we can imagine. And they're right. The things they're in high school and all the things they can do digitally, I have no clue on. So most people my age think, no, just send me the electricity bill, I could care less about all this so-called smart grid stuff. But the younger generations really have the ability, the tool to control their system all automatically by their standards, and we should have an open market. Now, not everybody bought cell phones. When I created the Galvin Electricity Initiative, like Bob Galvin said, he said, Kurt, I share your frustration with the lack of innovation in energy, but that's where telecommunications was 30 years ago. A lot of pent-up innovation and a regulated monopoly business model that has no incentive to innovate. So that's really the fundamental where we need to go. I need to wrap up here. So the financing here, the whole financing here, key factors. The energy investment constraints today, particularly I can hear Silicon Valley and all the companies here in Silicon Valley would love to get, and they have all the technologies to make the transformations here and around the world, but they have very little incentive to make any investments in this country. And when we demonstrate the benefits to both ratepayers and stockholders of these transformations, is almost immediately a multiple of the cost. So there's no reason why either ratepayers or stockholders should be penalized from the transformation of the power system. And so the financial sources and mechanisms can really be all, if we change the standards and the policies, the sources of energy for this can be as broad as necessary. And I'm pleased to see that many parts of the world are moving much more aggressively in that regard. Europe is quite a bit ahead of us in all of that. And finally, technical innovation. Entrepreneurial innovators are really the key here. This is not a centralized transformation. It will be implemented just as we did in the telecommunications and other industries. So in conclusion, I'd say energy is an essential prerequisite for economic development. It's kind of the bottom line. And energy is crucial for achieving a more equitable and sustainable world. So the 1.5 to 2 billion people who have no access to energy are really outside the world as we know it. And women are the biggest penalty payers in that. Energy technology expanded dramatically, but it is not being adequately implemented commercially because the incentives are not there to do it. Technologies for all this transformation has been there for the bulk of 20 years, but we've done very little to make it happen here. And fortunately, I'm seeing in some of our around the world, some of the areas in developing countries actually moving much more aggressively because they don't have an established system, so they can start with a clean sheet of paper and install a system that meets the needs of the future. And it requires, finally, robust public policy and institutional frameworks. And in this country, it is all state and local, and so that makes it more complicated. But in most of the world, it is a federal, national thing. So it can be done, and I think the GEA, strongly, as you'll hear from other chapters today, will really encourage countries to make that transformation. Thank you very much.